Welcome to the Content Strategy Interviews podcast. Each week, we talk with accomplished content strategy experts to share their wisdom with our friends in the content community. And now here's your host, Larry Swanson.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode number 18 of the Content Strategy Interviews podcast. I've got with us today Andrew Himes. He's a true pioneer. I mean, I've used that term a couple times in this podcast, but this guy really is a true pioneer in the field of content strategy. Back in 1992, he founded the MSDN, the Microsoft Developer Network, and which is, at the time, it's hard to remember now, but in 1992, Microsoft was pretty much it in terms of software development. So that was a very big deal. But I want to let Andrew talk a little bit more about his transition. He had been at Mac, working on a publication for the Mac developer world called MacTech, and then he made the transition to Microsoft. And in 1992, and then that was, and I just, as a quick context setter for folks who weren't around then, 92 is about the time that the Lynx browser came out, 93, 94, I think Mosaic came out. So this was like literally at the dawn of the web. And Andrew has this big pile of information he's working with and is doing it. But actually, I want to let Andrew talk about it a little bit, because I know you started in a different medium than the web when you first got there. So welcome, Andrew. And can you tell the folks a little bit more about your background and how you got started with MSDN?
Right. Well, so I should first of all say that I would never call myself the founder of MSDN. I would call myself one of several co-founders. And it really was a collaborative project. It wasn't my idea to start with. I was hired at the very, very beginning. Well, I'll just tell you a little tiny bit about that, and then we'll go back a bit. So the Microsoft Developer Network started as a project inside Microsoft to, for the first time, try to create a platform and a network for software developers to connect with, learn from, leverage resources and information and software development kits and so on from Microsoft. It was before the advent of the internet, or not the advent of the internet, but before the advent of the web. And so if you wanted to get software development kits, technical information, APIs and so on from Microsoft, you were lucky if you had a brother-in-law who was worked in some hardware department at Microsoft who could get you something. So MSDN was designed to, it was a subscription service. It was software as a subscription, but it wasn't online. It was, Microsoft would send you a quarterly CD that had content on it, including SDKs and technical articles and so on. And so you'd get this quarterly package in the mail with a CD in it. And then a monthly newspaper called MSDN News. And so I was originally hired to be the founding editor of MSDN News. And there was a whole team of people focused on developing the business case for MSDN and figuring out what are the channels through which we could provide information and support to developers and so on. So going back a few years before that, I kind of moved into this world accidentally. I had been working. I had a column that I wrote for a local computer newspaper in Seattle back in the 80s. It was called the Puget Sound Computer User. And every month I'd write a different article about how businesses were using computers in some bizarre new way. For example, to use a little known tool called a spreadsheet to track customers and markets and do accounting on and things like that. So I was learning as I went along, and there was a local Apple user group had the largest in the world. Actually, there were 25,000 Apple II users around the world who joined the Apple Co-op here in Seattle. And then the Macintosh came out, and so they decided to start a Macintosh magazine to go along with the Apple II magazine. And I was hired to be the editor of that Macintosh magazine. It was for end users, and it didn't really go anywhere. That is, they couldn't sell enough ads to support the magazine. So they were going to kill the magazine, and my boss told me, well, so we're killing this end user magazine for the Macintosh, and instead we're going to start a software developers magazine for the Macintosh. And by the way, you're the editor. And I said, well, no, I'm not actually. I've never been a software developer. I never took a class in computer science. All I know, I just pick up and learn as I go along. And they said, well, that's fine. You've got a choice. Either you're fired or you're the founding editor of MacTech, which is this software developers journal for the Macintosh. And I said, well, okay, I'll take the job temporarily, just because I've got to earn a living somehow. And so that's how I kind of accidentally became the founding editor of a Macintosh programming journal. And I discovered that if you have that job description, then everybody assumes that you must be smart, knowledgeable, and expert at something. And so they would talk to me as if I were, and I just asked a lot of questions and learned as I went along. And one of the most interesting things that I found at the very beginning was Apple was launching a product called HyperCard, which was a disk-based hypertext system, graphical user interface. It was the very first that was actually available for millions of people to potentially use. And it was shipped with every new Macintosh. I found this fascinating. So I got really interested in a whole set of technologies, including hypertext, expert systems, graphical user interfaces, interactive multimedia, scripting languages, all of these technologies that turned out to be, a few years later, the very foundation of the World Wide Web. And so when I was hired by Microsoft to start the same kind of publication at Microsoft for Windows developers as already existed in the Apple world, I brought that intense interest in those technologies and platforms with me. And so when on a day in 1993, I discovered something called a web browser, I was like, oh my gosh, this potentially wraps together everything that I've been passionate about and interested in for years now. And what it means is that ultimately we don't have to print this paper-based newspaper anymore. We can put it online. We don't have to send out a quarterly CD-ROM product with a bunch of bits on it. We can just publish it online. And so over the next couple of years, MSDN went through this really incredibly interesting process of, for the first time, discovering and implementing a software as a service product online that gave developers access to thousands of articles, every conceivable software development kit from Microsoft, sample code, advice, interaction, and connection to an online network. So all of that was it was an extraordinary educational experience for me that involved adventure and new relationships and being able to make use of and implement brand new technologies that nobody had ever tried to use in a big way before.
Right.
So,
we had talked earlier conversation about some of those technologies that you had developed. What was it called? Blackbird or something? It was like a proprietary a system, and that was in the works. So there's all this. It's just astonishing to me how much was going on. I love that it was your curiosity and your kind of just-in-time learning combined with the timing. It's such a great story. So there's all this stuff going on. It's like you're rebuilding the jet engine in flight. You're transitioning, like literally tens of thousands, millions. Like how many pages or I don't know, whatever units of content we're talking about? Must have been a huge amount of information.
Right. Well, it started just with the monthly newspaper, and then we extended it to the CD-ROM. It took a while for us to get there. The newspaper, came out every month, and it had 30 or 40 articles in it. And so when we thought about building an actual website, up until that point, Microsoft.com had existed, but the only content on it, nobody knew anything about it or ever used it. The only content on it was somebody wanted to learn HTML, and so they converted some random piece of content. It might have been a letter to your aunt or uncle, or it might have been something about source code in a C application, but it was just random information. So we decided, well, we want to build an actual publication online, and there were no tools available to do that. So we built our own. So our tool consisted of a Visual Basic script that was the front end to an Access database that was that contained pointers to a bunch of Microsoft Word files. And so what the tool did was pull all of those Word files in, run a script that converted the Word file to an RTF file, then another tool or another script that converted the RTF file to an HTML file, and then created automatic links among all of those documents and provided a home page that you could customize. So it was a very simple tool. Actually, it's the only tool that I knew about back then that actually created a set of pages and all of the links between them, and automatically converted all of the Word files to HTML. So
was that one of the first CMSs then, in a sense? Or
I think it was. We were managing all this content with a database for the first time. We were automatically generating HTML, and we were taking that set of things and then putting it out on the web as a comprehensive, a cohesive set of linked documents with a structure to them. And
so
then,
there was,
yeah.
I'm curious about like the information architecture of that, like how it was arranged, how like all the information, all the like how you navigated it, how things were labeled, taxonomies, did all that, which is all kind of like standard stuff now, but you were making it up on the fly. How did you because all those problems emerged, you solved them, and then how did you label them, and when did you start calling it information architecture, or did you call it, how did you organize things, I guess?
Well, we weren't the first people to talk about information architecture. That's what we called it, information architecture. But there was an intense and sophisticated and experienced set of group of people with a very highly sophisticated methodology for doing that. And so there was a standard for how you design structured documents. It was called SGML. And SGML, there were people who were, about the only people who knew about SGML were people with PhDs in information architecture and structured documents. And that had been going on, that had been in development in various parts of the world for several years. And we used SGML as a way to create a CD-ROM product that had a whole lot of structured information on it. So the CD-ROM, which could contain up to something like 600 megabytes of content and potentially thousands of articles, our group collected content from all over Microsoft, from every product group that had any product that might be addressed by any kind of programming. And we pulled all of that together, and we created a set of categories in a hierarchy that enabled us to pull all of it together into one thing, a file that was called a media view file that contained it was almost like, I suppose it was precisely like having a great big complicated website, but in a single file, and you place that single file on a CD-ROM. And you could only do that with a really sophisticated way of understanding the structure of the information, the relationship between different components of the information, and then ways to link bidirectionally throughout the information, right?
Right.
So what we did essentially in building an HTML a product or a website was greatly simplify SGML. We created a document type definition that described HTML as a tiny subset of the very much richer information architecture of SGML, and then shoved it out onto a server that was connected with the internet. So that was a very simple. It was a much simpler way to do things than what we were already accustomed to doing.
Right. And a lot of that, some of the things you just said, like, was Microsoft involved with like the W3C and those kind of things about standard setting? And like, I'm trying to remember exactly when HTML came, because the foundation of, it's my understanding that HTML was a derivative of SGML, but you were developing this proprietary thing that was also a derivative of SGML. I guess, did those correlate, or at some point did you go just to HTML? Or?
Well, as you said, it all stemmed from SGML, and so you could create a simplified version or an iteration of SGML that was useful for a very specific purpose in a context. So HTML was a document type definition, a DTD of SGML, and we were actually. When I say we, I mean at that point, Microsoft had the notion that Microsoft could create its own private version of the internet and provide a way for people to publish and to visit places within this private universe that Microsoft controlled. And so there was a system that you just alluded to. It was called Blackbird. Microsoft Blackbird. Blackbird was the code name for it, and the idea was, my group built the first Blackbird instantiation of the Microsoft Developer Network, and while we were doing that, I noticed that there was this other thing, the public open source thing. It was called the World Wide Web. So my group. I got together with my group and we looked at the technology. We understood that it was actually really simple to do and we could do it right away. And so we started working on that. A sidelight here is that one of my superiors at Microsoft, on hearing that we were working on both Blackbird and on the World Wide Web to do both together, came to me and said, you're overworking your team. And we don't want to burn anybody out. And so you need to stop working on the World Wide Web thing. That's not going to go anywhere. Nobody will ever look at it. Instead, focus on Blackbird. And my team, we talked about it and decided, well, that's insane. We're just not going to tell anybody. We'll keep on working on both.
I have to ask, what year was that? Because there was the famous Bill Gates memo, was it 94, 95, about the shift to focus on the web and HTML at Microsoft? So this was like, how long before that was this?
It was about 6 months before Microsoft did the pivot.
Okay.
So we went ahead and published a website kind of without making a big deal about it. Actually, I did go to my direct manager and say, we need a budget for graphics for this new thing called a website, and I was able to get $2,000 to build some little icons and stuff like that. But so when we already had a website for the only sizable audience for Microsoft, which was developers. Developers were the only people who owned web browsers back then because they were kind of on the cutting edge of adopting and exploring new technologies. End users really had never heard of the World Wide Web. So when Bill announced that Microsoft was making a big pivot and really focusing on the internet, we were the folks in the company who knew the most about it and had done the most to actually embrace the internet and decide that's where we're going to put our energy.
Wow, so what a great confluence of timing in terms of so many things going on there. You have an audience that's as poised as anybody in the world. I'm curious, was it tens of thousands? I remember that was like easily the largest developer community in the world at the time, probably still a significant one. How many people subscribed to that paper, MSDN publication when you first started?
Well, the first issue of our paper-based newspaper, we had 380,000 subscribers on issue number one, and within a very short time, those numbers were rapidly growing. So within literally 2 or 3 years, there were about 4 million subscribers to MSDN, and I don't know how many there are today. It's at least double or triple that. I'm certain. So so the number of people who got the news about our very first website was the number of people who were reading that newspaper and then decided to go check out something new here.
Right. Well, I'm curious, looking back on this, it must have been quite the whirlwind at the time, but you've had some chance to reflect on it now. Are there any, because the pace and the acceleration of technology and just how we do, not just technology, but practices and procedures of how we do things is evolving so rapidly. You kind of prototyped that in that role. Any take-homes from that about how people can manage the sort of digital freneticness in our lives?
Well, I think that you just asked the question that's impossible to answer. One thing that I really reflect on, my God, this is a long time. It was like, what? This is 2018, and we're talking about 25 years ago. Mm-hmm. So 25 years ago, I think that our expectations about what the internet was capable of doing were remarkably idealistic and somewhat naive. So not unfairly, I think it's not a bad thing to be idealistic and naive. As a matter of fact, lots of really cool things don't happen if you're not naive enough, and simply assume that, well, that's beyond us, or it's impossible, or it's all whatever. So I'll just tell you, for me personally, my attitude about the internet was it was without any contradiction, an entirely positive, revolutionary, and wonderful thing. So, for example, we in 1995 we were publishing the very first start page for the Internet Explorer, and we're part of the Internet Explorer's development process early on. And I started a column on the Internet Explorer start page, which had by then very quickly the daily audience for the IE start page went to upwards of $8 million or 8 million visitors within 1 year. Wow. And so we published a column on the future of the internet and the way that the internet changed the world. And I wrote the first column for that, or the first article for that column, and it was after I just returned from Europe, going to Amsterdam, and I visited the place where Anne Frank and her family had hidden during the Second World War, and I was very moved. I was reading Anne Frank's diary as I was flying back to Seattle from Amsterdam, and I was really moved by the power of her writing, of her perceptions, her sensitivity, her extraordinary view of the world that was so full of courage and compassion. And I was thinking, well, if Anne Frank had a web page or a blog, the word blog hadn't actually been used back then, but that's what we were doing. If Anne Frank had had access to publish the story of what was going on inside that secret annex in 1941-42, how might the world have been changed if we had learned what was going on in occupied Europe back then? And I published that story, and it was also before we ever used the word viral to describe how people were responding to ideas or stories on the internet. And there were thousands of people who wrote back to us saying, "This really mattered to me. I appreciate it, and I'm looking forward to seeing the internet have that kind of an impact." And of course, 25 years later, we can see that there are lots of ways that the internet or the web can be used, and not all of them support democracy, support human rights, support the transformation of our culture and our society toward justice and toward opportunity and toward freedom. So I guess for me personally, this story brings us to just a really interesting moment in human history when we can either learn to make all of those tools and all of that capacity, all that power available to everybody in order to transform the world so that it works for everybody in the world. Or we can use those technologies just to create little islands that are full of people like ourselves who believe like we do, and we use the power of the internet as a way to wall ourselves off from ideas and opportunities and possibilities that lead toward liberation instead of the other way.
Well, let me ask you a little bit about that, because I've seen a number of presentations. I saw Jaron Lanier, he was here in Seattle a couple months ago, and he talked about that as long as we're in a world where Facebook owns our attention and is selling it to people, that we're screwed, that we're not going to break out of those bubbles, that we're just going to constantly have things reinforced. What's his name? Andrew Keen, another Silicon Valley guy, was here recently at another town hall talk, made similar points that do you see, apropos of what you're just saying, your hope for this, do you see any initiatives or movements or things that people can do to restore that original, to give Anne Frank a website, that kind of thing, but I guess maybe more importantly, to have that in a context where there's opportunities for compassion and empathy and ways to take trolls to task and things like that.
Well, I know we're coming to the end of our time right now, so what I'll do is just tell you about a specific project that I'm working on right now with a lot of other people that I think is a really great example of the capacity of the internet to be a platform for social change that matters. So, my current initiative is called the Carbon Smart Building Initiative, and the idea is, today, global greenhouse gas emissions, 40% of GHGs are provided by the built environment. That is, buildings worldwide, 40% internationally of greenhouse gas emissions are caused by building and operating buildings. So I'm working with a bunch of other people led by the Carbon Leadership Forum at the University of Washington, which is headquartered, or which is the umbrella of the Carbon Leadership Forum is the College of the Built Environment at the UW. And our idea is that we can actually transform collectively with all of the potential partners in the world, in the building industry and in society, we can actually transform the built environment from part of the existential threat to human flourishing on Earth into a net carbon sink. So in other words, rather than a net emitter of carbon and a contributor to the problem of global climate change, the built environment can be part of the solution. And the vision here is that over the next 30 years or so, by 2050, we can create any new building can actually produce more power than it consumes by being truly high performing, really green, truly efficient in its use of energy. Secondly, we can move strongly toward having a completely clean grid worldwide that draws on sustainable energy resources. Thirdly, we can refit existing buildings so that they're far more efficient. And fourthly, we can actually make use of carbon storing materials to create new buildings with. So that's a vision that that we can really use the internet and a set of tools to collaborate, to communicate, to combine our forces, and to think together about truly in 1,000 innovative ways about how we can solve a problem. And the mechanism for that, the strategy for that, is something called a collective impact initiative. So think about all of the companies in the world, all of the researchers in the world. Think about companies that build buildings, companies that refit buildings. Think about the supply chain for the materials that go into buildings. Think about all of the smart people in the U.S. Green Building Council and the Athena Sustainable Materials Institute and the Architecture 2030 organization. Think about the American Institute of Architects and structural engineers worldwide, and companies that are involved in building buildings worldwide. This is a massive problem today, but it can be a massive opportunity for change, and it is enabled and enlivened and enhanced by the set of tools provided by the internet for creating solutions out of thin air.
Nice. That's a perfect note to end on, Andrew. Thanks so much. It's great having you on today, and I can think of 1,000 other conversations I'd love to have with you. But I'd love to come back and revisit some of this stuff. But thanks so much for taking the time to talk with me today.
This has been fun. It's a trip down memory lane, to use the cliche, for me, and I really appreciate getting a chance to talk about things that happened when lots of the world hadn't been born yet.
Yeah, I try not to think about that too much. Well, thanks again, Andrew, and it was fun walking down memory lane with you.
All right, thanks a lot then. Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening. Tune in next week for another content strategy interview.